Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us this evening for an artist talk with SR Lejeune. My name is Catherine Delmatter. I'm a studio collaborator here at Dieu Donné. For those of you who don't know, Dieu Donné is the leading cultural nonprofit organization dedicated to serving emerging and established artists through the collaborative creation of contemporary art using the process of hand paper making. I'm honored today to introduce today's speaker. SR Lejeune is an artist currently based in Pine Plains, New York. They received a BA with high honors from Oberlin College, were a core fellow at the Penland School of Craft, and hold an MFA in sculpture from the Yale School of Art. They were the books and paper studio coordinator at Penland School of Craft and have taught workshops at Penland, Yucca Valley Materials Lab, and Women's Studio Workshop. SR was the 2013 West Bayview Foundation Fellow at Dieu Donné, a 2024 Helene Wurlitzer Foundation Fellow, and a resident at Women's Studio Workshop in 2025. Recent solo exhibitions include Skylight at Chamber Lower Cavity in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and Witness Marks at Dieu Donné. They are currently building out a manual machine shop in upstate New York. So let's all welcome SR, and I'm going to turn it over to them.
Cool. Okay, I am going to share my screen. And Catherine, is my screen shared?
Beautiful. It is shared and we are ready to go.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Catherine, for facilitating. And thank you, Joan Hall, for supporting the West Bayview Foundation Fellowship for all of these years. I'm SR. I was the 2023 fellow at Dieu Donné, and I'm here tonight to talk to you all about my sculpture practice and ultimately circle around towards the work that I currently have on view in the gallery at Dieu Donné. So I'm going to begin just briefly with my trajectory. My first exposure to hand paper making was through the artist Amy Lee, who taught a really transformative month-long intensive at Oberlin College while I was an undergraduate, and then recommended me to Dieu Donné, where I was a studio intern 10 years ago, almost exactly. So from there, I kept seeking out paper, which led me through many different artist spaces and eventually to the Penland School of Craft in Western North Carolina, where I started out as a core fellow and then later became the studio coordinator for books and paper. So at Penland, this whole world of material possibility really opened up to me. I worked with metal and with wood, and I learned about carving and casting and weaving, and held all of this while keeping my relationship to paper at this kind of core. So I'm going to start this talk back in 2019 with a piece that I made while working at Penland. So the image here is of a building named Laurel. By the time that I got to Penland, Laurel had not been inhabited for quite a few years, but people who had lived there were still around, were still in the area, and described it as the kind of house that had always really belonged more to the landscape around it than to the people that had moved through it. The following photographs show a cast paper floor that I made for one of Laurel's bedrooms. And I wanted to make something for Laurel, the structure, with no people inside. And I start with this work because it holds qualities that I keep returning to as a paper maker. This understanding of paper as a means to get to know objects and to get to know places, as a record keeper, and as a ground for contradiction. So as much as paper is the stuff of seeming permanence, it's the stuff of books and of documents, and it's also quite temporary. So we're familiar with paper as junk mail, paper as plates for potlucks, paper as bathroom products. So Laurel was demolished in 2022. And this is an image of where it once stood just a couple months after the demo. And then 2 years after that, Hurricane Helene pummeled Western North Carolina. And I don't have a picture of what this spot looks like now, but I do still have that paper floor. These next images skip to the fall of 2023, where I had a residency at a project space called Lower Cavity in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which was inside of a former industrial paper mill. So in the basement of the residency are these three chambers, which were the rooms in which paper pulp was processed while the mill was operational. So I worked here on and off for many months, really getting to know the chambers by casting paper pulp directly onto surfaces in the building. So all of the white that you see in this image is my newly added layer of paper that's made from cotton rag. And once this was dried, I peeled it back. And my new layer became this kind of rubbing of the space, which was embedded with the dirt and the brick dust and all of this old dried pulp that was still coating the chamber walls. And then this rubbing also retained the marks of the building's, like what I think of as its post-industrial life. So this window hole, which was not functional to the original paper mill, but which was inserted later on in the trajectory of the architecture, also became a part of this rubbing. So I really think of this work as a way for me to get to know, I went over every crack in the floor and every crevice of this arched doorway, taking impressions of this place. So I'm moving non-linearly here and will throughout the presentation, but after Penland and before the residency in the paper mill, I completed an MFA in sculpture at the Yale School of Art, where I spent a lot of my time manually machining metal and thinking about how things are constructed, both mechanically and also emotionally. And in examining and thinking through this construction, I often came back around and found contradiction again. So a word like fabricate is one example. To fabricate means to technically build something and also to imagine something up. It's a fantasy. And I try to hold this idea of fabrication closely. We need to imagine how things could be. And I mean that both in reference to making sculpture and also to making relationships and making community and resistance more broadly. So while building, I make technical decisions that preserve a capacity for change. I'm usually bolting parts together rather than welding them. I'm riveting, I'm not gluing. And I think of this as this means to prolong the want that I have for parts to be able to shift and move. I want to make even what's supposed to be this moment of final presentation into something that could just in an instant take up space really quite differently. And I think of hardware as what enables this repositioning. So hardware itself, another one of those words of contradiction and of context, a word that can reference a piece as small as a fitting or a bolt, or represent the entire logic of how a system functions, like the insides of a computer. And I think a lot about words like this that are nouns and are verbs and are adjectives all in one, like the word bearing, which is the title of the piece I've been showing pictures of so far. Bearing is a way of being in a body. It is something's relevance to a matter at hand. To bear is a degree to which something can be tolerated. A bearing is a part made from softer material placed between harder, rotating parts of a machine. It's a thing that's designed to be consumed by friction. And it's also a way to carry pain. So these have all been images of a single work that I assembled from parts like hinges and wheels that I machined on the lathe and vertical mill. And I unfolded and folded this piece from sunrise to sunset throughout its installation. And I made this work while I also had a job in maintenance for a campus furniture library. And during this work, I became really enamored with casters, learning that before there was this prevalence of fixed electric wiring in the US, when rooms were mostly lit by fire, sun, candles, chairs and desks would often have these tiny wheels on their legs, so that these pieces of furniture could follow the light as it was changing and to always be in this kind of orbit. And so bearing this piece that's always in motion was accompanied by and bearing, which was a furniture dolly sized piece that stayed still, but was always being moved over, acting as this kind of sundial or a timekeeper. These two balanced rectangles of steel that were held up by so many swivel casters, all pointed in so many different directions that it actually can't move really at all. And I see narrative, I see maybe personal narrative in this, how something is made determining how something can or cannot possibly function. Like there's this poetics to materials and mechanisms, some power to being able to picture how a thing had to be held or had to be touched in order to come into being. Like knowing that a rivet is faster to assemble than a bolt is, but it's slower to take apart, or that a wing nut is designed to be loosened quickly by hand without need of grabbing another tool. And this work is called Horizon Line. And I made it to be reassembled differently for each new installation context. Its structure made up of parts that all facilitate movement and connection of some kind. And I think of machining as this means to connect beyond the set of presented options. And by this, I mean machining enables me to make wing nuts that are a quarter of the size of those that are available to buy, that I can mill clasps that are based on the latches of my overall buttons, that this means my work is not limited to the parts that are profitable enough to be sold in stores, that these are parts that are not commercially conceived of as being needed, but to this are essential. So this piece is always in transition. It's unwilling to hold the same position twice. And I think of my work as unfixed in this way most generally. Like it does not and will not reach this final point of completion, but it's something that can remain non-static, like bodies are non-static. The idea of making sculpture in these terms appears throughout my practice, and this is a work called Skylight, which took up the entire perimeter of a gallery. And I installed this work inside of a pre-existing reveal. A reveal is often seen in galleries. It's this 90-degree gap pictured on the left. It's created by layers of plywood and drywall that build the wall, but they're not brought all the way to the floor. And so I adhered this painted strip of sky and cloud to the underside of the reveal, and then I placed a strip of mirror polished stainless steel at an angle, which happened to be 25 degrees, so that it could reflect the hidden painting and make it visible. So a skylight, in most literal terms, is a tool to see something that would otherwise be obstructed. And sometimes all that can be seen in this work is that shiny quality of reflective material when it's not reflecting anything specific. Sometimes the work seems to be part reflection and part reflective. When the viewer moves, their sightline would shift and their eyes drew this new angle of relation. And so what one saw changed depending on where they stood. And two people next to each other may see something different depending on their height. And getting close, the image shifts again and you end up looking at yourself. So there's no singular designed experience of this work. Things that are seemingly still or simple or true are often in motion. Like this next piece, which is made from hundreds of springs of high carbon steel music wire, which I wound and then wove into panels similar to the way that springs are tied within a piece of upholstered furniture. So I stacked these panels on top of each other, the ones above weighing down those below, which created this form which started the size of an upholstered easy chair and has been slowly sinking since then. So it's in this state of constant compression. This piece is called yield. It's another one of those indefinite words that I'm just so fond of. Yield is a yellow traffic sign, but also a yield is the usable accumulation from a harvest. A yield point is the load after which a spring can no longer spring back when it's been altered by continuous use. To yield is when something gives in. This giving in could be structural, or it could be emotional, or it could be both of these things. So this past fall, I was at a residency in Taos, New Mexico, and I had the opportunity to work on a new iteration of this piece. So instead of one pile, I made this new work from many smaller sections, each pile about the size of the seat of a folding chair, but then coming together became something that is currently about the dimensions of a single-sized mattress. So in the same logic as the first iteration, individual springs are tied into panels, each panel a unit that could stack in infinite ways. But in this version, each pile then is also movable. Each pile can come together, but then they're also able to come apart. And so this is an ongoing project, and I'm still really figuring out what I want this work to do. But I do keep thinking about how when I was driving to Taos from New York, I saw this starling murmuration, like this twisting cloud of these small black birds, in which it was really impossible to isolate a moment of decision. But each movement from each bird had this impact that echoed throughout the entire flock. And I've been trying in this new work to remember and to represent that all of these wholes are made from parts, and that all of these parts present potential opportunities for intervention and for restructuring, which feels important now as ever. So as promised, I've been moving non-linearly again. So now we'll switch to before Taos, but a few months after finishing graduate school. This is the time when I began the West Bayview Foundation Fellowship at Dieu Donné. So during this fellowship, I worked really closely with Amy Jacobs, Tatiana Ginsberg, and Catherine Delamater to support studio projects and to learn about what it means to collaborate with artists in this kind of studio context. So here is an updated yellow apron selfie back at Dieu Donné 8 years after I was first a studio intern there. And during this time, I was doing a lot of back and forth between the Hudson Valley and Brooklyn, and Grand Central became this kind of pivot point for me. It was this last look up as I was exiting from Metro North. In the city, I noticed myself predominantly looking down at the concrete and thinking a lot about this term witness mark, which I had known initially through metal, through machining, in which a witness mark is a texture that's left by an act of fabrication. It's a mark that doesn't get overridden by a next operation. A witness mark is this visual information that's left behind. It's something that it's a mark that tells how something was made. So as an example, in metal, the swirl that you see on the brass part in this image is a texture that resulted from the cutting action of the end mill, which I had used to form it. And then in land surveying, witness marks are these established points, those plus marks that you see stamped into concrete, the axes that locate a digital rendering to our world as it's in use. So these symbols and colors that we pass over really hold this whole language. And this is not just in reference to what's going on above ground, but also below it. So, like orange marks typically mean communication lines, and whites are for proposed excavation. Pinks sometimes are for things that are temporary, or they're there to indicate facilities that haven't been identified yet. So the ground is really full of these reminders that we're always moving through some space that's been constructed. The sidewalk is kind of like a clock, like these days and months will pass. And I was kind of tracking them by watching chewing gum as it was turning black, or seeing information fade, like not reapplied, or the signs of something that was forced to skid to a stop. And these things that seemed so solid were really actually slowly wearing away. And so I felt like I was watching the ground kind of continuously rinsed and eroded and repaired as I was walking back and forth from my fellowship. And then in all of this walking and all of this working, sidewalks began to really feel like paper to me. Their materiality shaped by water and by touch. And so I was collecting these images as I moved through the city and getting to know the ground of this place that I was returning to. And I started bringing these images into the studio as a way to process what I was seeing. So the resulting series called Witness Marks came from those images, which I was using as reference points as I worked. And some pieces were, pretty directly iterative. Others became these more abstract kind of extrapolations. For example, this piece came from this spot that I would walk over on Carlton on my way to Dieu Donné every single day. And this is my own iteration of that stain that was ever changing. And yeah, its mystery was eventually sort of a little bit ruptured for me by the realization that it was actually the spot in the neighborhood where all of the dogs would like pee every single day. But yeah, in some kind of seriousness, I still hope that my version retains this kind of mystery and beauty and sense of movement that I was finding there as a part of a daily routine. So throughout my time at Dieu Donné, I had access to the studio to develop my own body of work. And as a part of the fellowship, I was granted what's called the professional week, during which I made work in collaboration with the Dieu Donné studio team. So again, just want to take this opportunity to express gratitude to the master collaborators, Amy and Tatiana, who are pictured, and also to studio assistant Margot Bridges, the then print fellow Alejandra Arias Sevilla, and the Dieu Donné collaborator and our lovely host tonight, Catherine, the last three of whom were not captured in these photographs, but were really of crucial support in a variety of ways. So during this time, we predominantly produced a series of 30 by 38-inch pieces, a portion of which are in the exhibition that's currently on view at Dieu Donné. And the support while working really enabled this jump in scale and in production and in experimentation, and offered a really unique perspective into what artists experience in the studios, which I really feel like I'm going to carry with me as I continue on building and collaborating and teaching. So the images that follow are some of the works that I made while at Dieu Donné. some of them in the studio on my own time, and some during this professional supported week. So this series is of these like snippets of asphalt and sidewalks, which became kind of like landscapes or skyscapes. These focuses on gaps and stains. And the images were formed and changed through the accumulation of layers and layers of translucent fibers that were pigmented and pulled and manipulated on the surface of the mold, and then rinsed and eroded with the hose, not unlike how the sidewalk is rinsed and eroded with snow and rain. So I was trying to capture those access points, those witness marks, the spray of surveying markings, and all these compositions kind of came from this place sort of between iteration and extrapolation, which goes back to the idea that I was talking about at the very beginning of this presentation, of fabrication. So to make, and also to make up. I metal dried a lot of these pieces, which means that while still wet, these sheets were pressed onto polished stainless steel. And then this process transfers that hard shine of the metal onto the paper, by altering the ways that the fibers reflect and absorb light. And so at times I use this method to hit all the high points in a many layered sheet, which is what's happening in this image on screen right now. And the lighter tone is created by these higher mountains of pulp, which dried in contact with the metal and then appear burnished. And in contrast to the darker marks, which come from the valleys that were too low to be affected. And then in other works, I was masking off sections like the darker gray rectangle that stands out in this image, so that only part of the piece ended up pressed against the metal. And so in photographs, this appears as this difference of flat tones, like the darker gray strip at the top of this work is. But then in natural light, the shift in surface texture is exposed as you're walking past the piece. So a singular image changes depending on where you stand and how the light is bouncing off of it. And so although I spent my fellowship focusing on this body of flat works instead of those pulp casting methods that I had began the talk with, I was always thinking about these works in these textural and dimensional terms. So these pieces are formed through the accumulation of 20 or 30 of these super, super thin layers, which then when pressed become singular pieces of paper, these earlier selves in part obstructed, in part peeking through. This is the only work in the series that's just one layer. So it was one of the last sheets that we pulled, and coincidentally looked just like one of my photographs of gum on concrete, which I took as like a, what do they call it? Like a proof of concept. So we just left it as is. And in this piece, the mold face itself is watermarked. The mold face itself watermarked the really thin layer of that silver linen. Those vertical stripes that you can see was caused by that slight height differentiation where the brass mesh of the mold is sewn onto the supporting ribs. And this causes the pulp to accumulate with different density, and creates a witness mark. So at the beginning of this year, I had a residency at Women's Studio Workshop in Rosendale, New York, during which I kept really teasing out this train of thought, and really thinking about how to use the tool and process marks of making paper to build imagery. So for base sheets, I was mixing together pulp that was cleared from previous layers And this assortment of fibers came together kind of like mixing aggregate for concrete, these different densities, different fiber sizes. And I liked the noise that this created. It was full of information to respond to with these little bits that traveled through the entirety of the series. So I was never really starting fully anew, always kind of building on what had come before. And things like a shade of orange became, a link across multiple pieces, or the depth in a chromatic gray became, was the product of these many colors all mixed together. And I started working a lot less from the photographs of sidewalks themselves and more from my memory of those photographs and thinking about things like that feeling of like a rumble strip on a highway. And I was developing these scraping methods to emphasize fiber collected on the ribs of a lathe mold, really centering the inherent marks from tools. I would start with these black backgrounds and add more and more translucent layers, tiled and overlapped, to bring in this light unevenly, and really doing things like not observing these best papermaking practices. So doing, these things that we're trained against, like letting droplets fall off my hands onto the sheets, these drops called papermaker's tears, or letting fiber build up on the edge of a mold without cleaning it off, or really running with that cloudy effect that's not usually desirable and is caused by overshaking, a sheet of well-beaten abaca. And so I wasn't smoothing these things out or away, but I was using them as the means to construct images. And I made a lot of this work with pulp that I had processed from linen and cotton rag, broken down old clothes and fabric scraps, like one of my dad's shirts or my roommate's pants. And I was placing these individual strips of material for the work to dry in contact with, so I could get that change in interaction with light, sort of akin to that earlier use of metal drying that I was talking about. So the Witness Marks exhibition is of this series, and it's bringing together works that were both made at Dieu Donné as a part of the West Bayview Fellowship, and then where I went with that body of work as a resident at WSW. And so I'm going to end this talk with this kind of brief photographic walk around of the exhibition at Dieu Donné. So for those who have not been to the gallery, it's this like long and narrow space. So this is the view straight down, where there are 14 pieces installed. This is as if you're like looking left when you first come in. This is looking right and moving down the hallway, which ends at the flat files in these two works. So the exhibition is open through June 6th, and you're able to make an appointment through the Dieu Donné website. In order to view it, you'll need access to the Navy Yards, and they can help facilitate that. And yeah, I'll wrap up the presentation here. So thank you all so much for being here for the talk. And I'm going to hand it back to Catherine so we can continue the conversation.
Hello. I'm here. So we have a couple of questions. So this, I'm going to combine one that we had in the Q&A box with one that I jotted down during your talk, which was, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how you keep your practice flexible. Like we could see that there was an interdisciplinary process, right? That you were working across machining, paper making. And I think I was really struck by how hard like some of those machined pieces are compared with then what I know about paper pulp and how soft it is. So could you talk about how you're coming up with your decision making for the, what projects fall to what materials?
Hmm. Well, I think there's like a few things at play, right? It's like at times, um, you have to make the most of what's available to you at a certain point in time. So if I have access to like an incredible space like the Dieu Donné wet studio, like of course paper is going to come to the fore. Um, and on the other side of that, like when I was in school, having access to a like really well set up machine shop. Um, and I mean, I don't think it's as simple as like, this is what I have now, so this is what I can do. But I do feel like I have this kind of like ever running um, sort of like mix of thoughts and questions and potential things to pursue. Um, and I'm just like continuously sort of like waiting through that in relation to like what logistically I can do at a point in time. Um, I'm trying to think of like the less sort of like technical answer to that question. But I guess like all of it feels like it's these related currents, and then there's ways in which a particular material would be better suited to speaking to something. Like I've tried casting, I end up just using them as like teaching samples, but I've made cast paper wheels and like casters before. And that was this like multi-part mold assembly problem to solve that I got super focused on, but I could never really figure out why those wheels had to be paper. And so I think that's like, and maybe in some ways gets at answering that question where, yeah, sometimes I'm just like trying it out and then it just can't ever, it just isn't that for whatever reason.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like we talk about that a lot in the studio here, that idea of like thinking through making. Like you kind of get this idea, you have to try casting the wheel in paper, and then that propels you to like why it needs to be something else, or just kind of like propels you to the next thing. Um,
Yeah, and just to build on that, it's like in some ways that becomes like further fodder for why the wheel is brass. Some of that is, yeah, because yeah, it's like the properties of that material, it's the way it looks, it's what it does. And then for me, at least in that work, it kind of kept going back to the way that bearings just like are often made out of brass because it's softer than steel. And so it's there between these harder parts so that it can wear down, or again, or as a wheel it's softer than steel is but maybe more resilient than wood is, and so it'll last longer without scratching your floor or whatever. So it's like all of those become a part of it.
Was there something like you said, you've been making paper for, or you started at Dieu Donné 10 years ago, etc. Was there something in making this body of work that you feel taught you something new about paper making, like a quality of it that you hadn't quite realized, or something that was really surprising or inspiring, or something along those lines?
Mm.
Because I think it's interesting when you have as much experience as you do with the medium, which all of the West Bayview Fellows come in with a foundational knowledge in paper making, that I feel like when you're immersed in it in some way,
Mhm.
interesting things rise to the surface. And I was wondering if any of those rose for you.
Totally. I mean, I think being in the studio with a lot of artists working in different ways, um, like you gather information from that, like watching someone work really tightly with like a screen like a silkscreen or uh, cut Durlar stencil matrix and making like really, really tight work, um, there's like always this kind of like attraction towards those technical ways of being. And then I could never kind of get it to fit in with the thing that I wanted to make. Like when I tried to make a stencil, it never really felt right or something. And I felt like I needed to figure out a way of working with paper again. Um, and I really wanted to like push myself to make the most of this ability to work in these like large scale flat way, which is like as yeah, for the paper makers here, like Noah is like really like a unique and rare opportunity to be able to work like that. Um, and yeah, I just needed to figure out how to feel like, yeah, myself in relation to that. And that wasn't something I had done with making flat work since I was like an undergraduate. So I'm kind of like meandering around your
No, I
question,
think even
but
that idea to like make something flat, like the challenge of that.
mhm, mhm. And also just to like have the process make sense with the imagery, like, and I feel like I was sort of talking about this as I was speaking, but this kind of like rinsing and eroding and this way of having it feel like I was almost like becoming like the elements in relation to what I was making, like needing to develop all of these strategies and like for like, oh, and when you're in the studio you come up with funny names of things, like you're like, oh, this one we're gonna pull in like the wavy way, or like the the bumpy way, or the whatever. And so like just coming, I think having seen rules get broken and like uh I don't want to call them like effects, but like marks being made through these um like in so many different ways. Like sometimes you're in the studio and like this tool that you never thought was going to be essential, that has, is like a sponge taped to the end of a pencil or something like that, is like exactly the thing that's needed to make something happen. And so I think, yeah, Dieu Donné, the answer is like rarely no, or like that's impossible. And so being in that energy and figuring out how to like apply it, like I knew there had to be ways to make something look the way I wanted it to. And so could kind of like lift bits and pieces from how I'd seen other projects come together. Um, I'm rambling,
No,
but
that was great. Okay, we have one last question for you, which I think maybe a lot of people are wondering. Do you have any reading recommendations on art making or materials and creative thinking in general? And I know you read a lot.
I do read a lot. Um, I am like all over the place when I'm reading. I feel like I'm drawing from like so many different sources. Like half the time I'm like looking at like those kids books, like how things work, like with like diagrams, or like uh old textbooks about like machine repair, like that sort of like one category of things that I think is in the sort of scientific language of that, also full of relevant ideas to trying to creatively express something. And then I also have, I'm trying to think, like, I return often to Harry Dodge's work, both my meteorite and also this earlier, it's called, I'm probably going to butcher the title, but like Notes on Indeterminacy, River of the Mother of God, Volume 1, I think it's called, or something. As a long name, but it's on Harry Dodge's website, as well as Gordon Hall's writing has meant a lot to me. Um, and Sarah Ahmed, uh, like every book Sarah Ahmed has written. That's just like a scattering of various people, but yeah, that lots of lots of poetry. I don't know. Whoever you are with that question, you can email me and I will give you a reading list in some form of things that I like. Um,
We had two more questions come in. Do you have it in yet to do two?
Sure.
They're good. They're good questions. Um, One is you mentioned compression with the spring sculptures. Um,
Mhm.
and there's also compression plays a big role in paper making.
Um,
And this viewer is wondering if you've like formed, like, do you see an explicit relationship between that, use of compression in your work? Is that sort of coincidental,
hmm. Oh, I love that connection.
right?
Yeah,
I
that's
knew it
really
was a good one to ask.
yeah. Um, yeah, it comes up so much also with casting with pulp too. Just like pushing out all of the water. um, hmm. I think I need to think more about that. I mean, just my gut reaction is that in making work, I'm like often trying to process something, like whether that's like an obsession with a particular mechanism or obscure part of like furniture history or trying to figure out what these like marks are on the sidewalk. And like through all of that, I'm like carrying around my own body and self. And yeah, I don't know, experience a lot of those feelings of like pressure or like tightening and like moving inwards. Um, and so like, yeah, maybe there's some way that I'm also trying to like work through that like with different um materials. I mean, the ability to compress feels like both it holds potential energy, it holds stress, it holds strain. Um, and it's also like a really resilient thing to be able to do is like, to like bounce back from things. And so um I don't know. Thank you for that question. I feel like I need to do some writing, a little more writing
Yeah.
on
It's like a prompt. It's something for you to take
that.
away from this
Totally.
after sharing so much with us. I think that that's a really beautiful note to end on. I love these kind of like point of departure or like to be continued
Mm.
sort of nature of things. I do just want to let people know also if you are interested in learning about paper making or residencies or any of that, we have a lot of resources available on our Dieu Donné website, including opportunities to take summer classes in hand paper making with various instructors, former fellows, all of that. So if you are inspired to want to get your hands into some pulp or come see this space, that would be a great place to start. And thank you, SR, for taking time to share all of these wonderful ideas with us. And thank you all for attending this evening. We really appreciate your support and interest.